All right, what I'd like to do now is go through the details of the experience of fusion, of bad love, of unintegrated self in a relationship. I'll then characterize merger, good love, and the main characteristics that would exemplify a relationship like that. You should be having a pencil in your hand, and this will give you a love checklist. And in fact, Dr. Ekoff at the end of her article literally gives an appendix, a one-page juxtaposition of all the key concepts on this continuum. And I think that's a very useful tool, and I'll go over the details of that at the very end. All right, so let's start with a difficult one, fusion. This is sometimes hard to even talk about because it evokes in people an awareness of a great deal of pain. So try to be aware of this material, and as best you can, try to hold a place of curiosity about your own mind. And you're going to, this material will inevitably evoke some anxiety in most of you. Certainly it did in me the first time I read this. Matter of fact, as I went through this checklist the first couple of times, oh my God, that's me. Oh my God, I've done that. I've done the other thing. I'm a mess. It's terrible. We call that the graduate student disease. As we study psychopathology, it seems like everybody that's studying all these different mental illnesses has them all. And what that says is the human mind is pretty complicated, and we probably do have a little potential for all of those, and we can recognize it in ourselves. So this isn't a list of accusations. This is a list of opportunities to get better. That's the way I hope you think about it. And again, one has to be gentle with yourself because this is psychically determined. This is unconscious. It's developmental. It was laid down before you had the use of language or understood how to use language very well at all. In some ways, okay, we can say you're responsible for your relationships, and morally and ethically and practically you are. But you're not responsible for your childhood. You're not responsible for the person that you were formed as. You're responsible for what you do with that. So the first step is to simply recognize and understand, as opposed to judge, that you've been dealt a certain hand out of the deck that someone else dealt, your parents, and that perhaps just understanding that is a good place to start, understanding all of these sometimes rather difficult elements. So, the core element of a fused relationship, the way a fused individual functions, is that they really are undifferentiated between themselves and the other. They can't tell the difference between the inside and the outside. They can't tell where they stop and the other person starts. That's one of the reasons boundary violations are so obvious. If you find yourself checking your partner's pockets, looking at their email. I had a couple one time, and they were both sort of IT people, and he had hacked into her computer and read all of her emails and was outraged that he found some emails that were a little incriminating about a relationship she was having. And it never occurred to him that perhaps hacking into her email was a problem in and of itself. He was totally justified in that. And that's the undifferentiated self and other. It was justified because he was threatened and his identity was vulnerable. And so to do that sort of thing was rationalized, okay? So the core experience of a fused person is a sense of their lack of integrity, a lack of, and I don't mean that ethically or morally, I mean that structurally. That who they are is a bit ephemeral, a bit unstructured, a bit nebulous, and they don't have a sense of a stability that can weather the storm, even little storms sometimes. And when that happens, we unconsciously bond with each other at this level. And again, none of this is conscious. We do these things and then we make up excuses for them after the fact. We're not a rational creature, we're a rationalizing creature, and the power of the unconscious has to be reckoned. Again, nobody does this by themselves. This is always a joint venture. This is always about a kind of mutual dependency, and that there are no, this is the hardest part. This is the part that most people get very nervous about when I say. There are no innocent victims in a relationship. That sounds a little harsh, especially when we see examples of domestic violence. But the truth is, every relationship, if they're close together on this continuum, is getting something out of that relationship. You understand, I think now, the phrase masochism or depression. People enter into relationships to live out their own sense of self-image. And if they feel guilty, if they feel bad, if they feel worthless, if they feel like they get meaning in their lives out of self-sacrifice, then they will find someone who matches their pathology and is willing to hold them as guilty, to punish them for being bad, to exploit their willingness to altruistically sacrifice themselves. You're in a relationship for unconscious, dynamic reasons. And I think the first shocking reality is that there are no innocent victims in a relationship. And if you think you're the innocent victim, you need to reevaluate. That's the domestic violence victim I kept talking to before. Why do you keep doing this? Because I love him, for the good of the children. And those extreme examples, again, may be too much, but it's not good for the children to witness domestic violence. How could you possibly think that's good? And what most of the time happens when the children are allowed to be a witness, what they're witnessing is the one parent's masochism, one partner's willingness to suffer and getting a feeling of moral self-righteousness out of it. It's not for the children. It's never for the children. In any realistic developmental way that in terms of the children's developmental needs. It's pathology acted out and rationalized. There are no innocent victims in relationships. All right, and I've already talked about how separation risks the loss of the self. That's what happens when the self is unintegrated. The relationship is substituted for the whole self. Boundaries are porous. Boundaries are sometimes non-existent. Hypersensitivity is the norm. In a fused person, what we see very often is a vulnerability that's hypersensitive, hyper-vigilant to any slight, to any threat, to any insult, because they're not strong enough to manage the sort of ebb and flow of daily difficulties. Life is difficult. Life is full of pain and anxiety, and it's hard sometimes. And a person without a stable sense of identity often structures their lives in ways that are quite rigid. There's a rigidity to a fused personality, a rigidity that comes from a desperate, almost vulnerability, an inability to manage anxiety at any high level at all. And the rigidity is in part what causes these repetitions. A fused person's life is narrow. They don't play. They don't get out and try new things. They're only comfortable doing what their routines they've become comfortable with. And they almost never get outside of those routines because it's too scary. To try something new represents a threat. It also takes such a massive amount of energy to maintain this artificial structure that there's very little energy left over for creative growth and healthy love. So I think that's one of the central problems in treating someone who's disturbed in this way, is that the very nature of their disturbance, the rigidity, the fear, the anxiety, run counter to what's necessary for being in therapy. And frankly, most folks don't come to therapy if they're that disturbed unless there's some major crisis in their life. Their partner is threatening to leave them. They've lost a job because of their inability to do the work. They've got an addiction of some kind that's threatening to disrupt their life dramatically. Most people don't come to therapy to enhance their personal growth. I wish that was the case, but what I see is the tragedy almost, the human tragedy of the very nature of their problem, making it harder and harder for them to get the help they need, either therapeutically or from their partner or from each other. What happens in a fused person if they do get stimulated too much? Well, the phrase is flooding. And I think that's a perfect metaphor. That's what it feels like to a fused person, to be overwhelmed, to be flooded with emotion, anger, fear, anxiety. They're threatened at an existential level, psychically. They're threatened at that level unconsciously. And the terror that that evokes is overwhelming. You get a sense of the sort of deer in the headlights look. Anxiety freezes thinking. They demand and they can physically force whatever is happening to stop because they can't tolerate that much input, that much activity, that much feeling. They get flooded and then react as if you were in a flood, because a flood is a dangerous thing. I think that word is actually pretty profoundly accurate in terms of the fused person's experience of more than they can tolerate. What does that flooding evoke in them? A desperate need to control. Fused people are hyper-controlling. You all know someone like this. Someone that's got to be in control all the time. Well, they need to be in control all the time for no other reason than they're vulnerable, they're weak, then they're afraid that if they're not in control, they'll be flooded with dangerous emotions they can't possibly tolerate or handle. And God knows where that's going to go. So they're rigid and controlling. These people are not subtle. They don't have a great deal of ambivalence. Someone says something and they've got a right and a wrong answer for things. What does that sound like? Splitting. Splitting is the surest sign of a fused relationship. All black, all white, all right, all wrong, no subtlety, no ambivalence, love or hate. You're either for me or against me, okay? And frankly, this is a good way to talk about our political system. I mean, I think we've completely degenerated it into splitting at this point. No one's actually discussing policy, the rational results of particular policies. They're just haters. Everybody's hating everybody else. Everybody's accusing everybody else of being a bad person. That's a sign of splitting. That's primitive. At the cultural level, we see individual dynamics being acted out at the cultural level. I'm going to save the rest of that lecture for social psychology. That's going to be down the road a ways. But we see these dynamics being acted out on larger planes, in organizations, in communities, in nations, between nations. The human psyche is present at multiple levels. Okay, enough about that. No ambivalence. What that translates into very often is a failure, what we call a failure to symbolize. You cannot think abstractly. You can't wonder theoretically, philosophically about the meaning of things. There's no ability to tease apart possibilities in an argument, to see possibly that the other side might in some way have a point. If they don't agree with you, they threaten you, and you must annihilate them. They must be bad. If I'm in danger of being overwhelmed, it must be because you're evil, and I get to attack you in every way that's possible because it's justified by the nature of my terror, psychically, unconsciously, and in reality it, of course, isn't anywhere near that. But we are creatures driven by unconscious dynamics more than anything else. And I think that's what I meant, the failure of symbolization. I think that's what I meant when I said feelings are facts to the fused. You could write that down. And it's a little mnemonic, maybe, a little mnemonic device, a little way to remember this. Are feelings facts? You have a feeling, and is there a little part of you that can go, wow, I'm feeling really something here. I'm having an intense feeling. What is that about? Did you really do something that bad? Or is something in me being evoked that I need to become more mindful of? If you can ask that question, if you can go, whoa, intense feeling, hello, what is that about? You are way up on the merger end of the potential scale here. I mean, that's a sign of great strength, of great courage, of great integration and wholeness. If you automatically go to action, if you act out a feeling because you can't tolerate it, then you're not aware of its source, and you end up this experience of concrete thinking. Feelings are facts, and you act on them because they feel justified, when in reality you're simply catastrophically unaware of your own unconscious dynamics. And that's the great tragedy. We have in these people such fear, such hate, such anxiety. And when you have those intense motions boiling around inside of you, There's simply no other way to, there's no way to learn. There's no way to be open. There's no way to think. Anxiety, fear, hatred freeze the ability to think. Thinking is a derivative of strong emotional containment, of healthy sense of identity. Emotion, if that's solid, then thinking is a possibility. If it isn't, the best we can do is rationalize. It can get to the point where this fusion dynamic seems almost delusional. And I bet you know someone. I mean, the classic example is the woman or the man whose partner's been cheating on them. And they're in denial. And we all know that. I mean, that's 100 years ago Freud understood that. But what's going on a little more carefully? How is it that they're in denial? Everybody knows their partner is cheating. It's common knowledge. It seems like they're the only one that doesn't know. But at some point, that isn't just denial, that's delusional. And it makes sense to move from simple defense mechanism like denial to a whole, almost psychotic, delusional process. Because if it's that delusional, it must mean there's a reason for it. It must mean the reality of acknowledging the cheating would fragment their identity. It wouldn't just inconvenience them, it wouldn't just make them mad, it wouldn't just let them feel betrayed. It would destroy their sense of self because their self is tied to the functioning of the relationship. If that is broken, they are annihilated, and a much more extreme defense, a delusional system, is created to maintain that. And guess what? That doesn't work very well for very long. But a person faced with the possibility of avoiding catastrophe in the here and now often takes it rather than experience such terror as recognizing the truth of the meaning of their partner's behavior. The dominant theme in relationships like that, inevitably, is fear. And you can see it and you can feel it. And when you're around people like that, if you're attuned at all, you can sense it. Fear, if you're afraid of someone hurting you, the natural response is anger. So that the fused position, if two people are in a fused relationship, it is inevitably a hostile relationship. When my patient hacked his fiance's computer, that's hostile. That's almost a violent act in and of itself. It's certainly an emotionally violent act, if not a physical one. And what we find over and over is that without exception, domestic violence relationships are on the fusion side of the scale. The very definition of a fused relationship, the very definition of a domestic violence situation, is that our people are tied into a hostile emotional dynamic. And it very often, and we have to be clear about this, it is always mutual. That there isn't usually, I don't think I've ever seen an example of the sadistic one hooking up with the masochistic one. It doesn't go, the sadomasochistic dynamic. What happens in my experience, inevitably, is that they switch back and forth. Sometimes the guy is the tyrant, sometimes the woman is the tyrant. Sometimes it switches back and forth in a bizarre, rather rapid sequence. In any case, that kind of dynamic is always hostile. And this is a sensitive topic. What about sexuality in this dynamic? Sexuality in a fused relationship is itself about hostile control. It's not about joy, it's not about mutuality, it's about containment, control, domination, and submission. It is almost never creative, it is never really joyful, it is never about the other person's pleasure. It is really a manifestation of their consistent behavior around the question of control. It's often quite brutal, it's often quite narrow, repetitious, rigid, concrete. The sexual relationship in this kind of dynamic is very often, at best, unpleasant. Now, I've had patients who described a sexual intensity that was astonishingly powerful. I mean, screaming and yelling, and orgasms. lots of them. And I think what happens is that virtually everything gets channeled into a narrow sexuality, that it's not a healthy sexuality. It isn't the whole person coming into a sexualized, intimate, physical relationship. Two whole persons coming in and broadly exploring their bodies to mutual advantage. We're going to get some more details on good love and sexuality in a little bit. But for right now, understand that there may be moments in a fused sexual relationship that appear intensely passionate, but it's passion built on a violent, coercive intensity, fear, anger, and control. That doesn't mean it can't be intense. It can't mean that at moments it can't be almost orgiastically amazing or ecstatic. The question is, how long does that last? Is that just this rare and compulsively entered into physical relationship? What happens after? In a fusion relationship, the sexuality becomes isolated. It becomes compulsive. And the rest of the relationship remains, as I've described, rigid, hostile. And people stay together for this kind of intimate sexuality when they don't see that it really is not very soothing at all. It can be intense, it can be passionate, but do not mistake an intense physiological passion for an emotionally healthy sexual connection. I'm using a lot of words here. I have a sense that most of you will sort of instinctively or intuitively understand the difference. I hope so. Sexuality in a fusion relationship is about object usage, domination, and submission. It isn't joyous, it isn't playful. There seems to be a lack of meaningful soothing beyond the intimate sexual aspect itself. Once we get out of the bedroom, then we're back in that rigid, concrete relational dynamic. The irony of the intense sexuality of the fused couple is that because of its hostility, what we mostly see is that fused couples rarely can maintain monogamy. The irony here is that the intensity is unsustainable, and the desperate need for some intimate soothing drives people in these kind of relationships outside their relationship, even at sometimes great risk to themselves. All right. Another element that will indicate a fused relationship: time. What is their sense of time? In a fused relationship, there is only the here and now. There's no long past, there's no expectation of a long future. If there's a crisis, if there's pain, if there's suffering, if there's anxiety, it is overwhelming, it is right now, it has to be dealt with, you have to fix it, stop doing what you're doing now. Do this for me now, it has to happen now. The sense of time is narrowed down to the immediate moment. That is a sure sign of fusion. If you're in a crisis and conflict in relationships is inevitable, the mistake that people make frequently is that somehow if you're really in love, you never have an argument. That's a delusion. Normal people get into differences of opinion about lots of things. In fact, one of my favorite science fiction writers 40 years ago, Robert Heinlein, said, if two people agree on everything, one of them isn't necessary. I think from this perspective, if two people agree on everything, one of them or the other is submitting absolutely to the domination of the other. It's not that they don't disagree. It's that disagreement is threatening and therefore repressed massively. So you can have a loving conflict with your partner at the merger end of the scale. In fact, that's frequently an opportunity to do some creative growth. One of my favorite psychoanalytic thinkers is Marian Milner, and she actually took the position, and I think this is simply true, that conflict is inherent in human nature, and not only is it inherent in human nature, it's necessary in loving relationships as the source of potential creativity. That we are never so likely to grow as when we're challenged. And that challenge is inevitably in the nature of a conflict. And so we resolve it, if we're good, at a higher level, as opposed to crushing the opposition, denying the conflict, and staying in this rigid, isolated repetition. Conflict in healthy people is the source of potentially great growth and joy and mutual respect. Conflict in the fused is a source of nothing but danger. It has to be avoided at all costs. So the time, if I'm a loving person in a healthy relationship, and if I'm together and we have conflict, my response is, this is a conflict. But you know, we've been together for 5, 10, 15 years. We've had conflict before and worked them out. Let's take another look at what this really is all about. Oh, and by the way, I've been looking forward to spending another 5, 10, 15, 20 years with this person, anticipating a great deal of love and joy. Really? This conflict would threaten all that? I don't think so. Let's take an honest look at what it's really all about. So in the merger side of healthy love and healthy self-structure, time is broadened. We maintain a relationship with a past and a future. Past that has more good responses and more good experiences than bad, or it wouldn't last. And therefore, we have hope for more good responses in the future, more joy, more opportunities for growth in the future. Fusion, here and now, is all they can think about. Okay, merger. Let's look at the good stuff for a while. You can almost get depressed thinking about all the bad things that people do to each other in relationships. Okay, first thing about merger is that it is a beautiful source of continued personal growth. We build internal structure in the context of a loving relationship. We get stronger together. We integrate those parts of us that remain split off and fragmented. And there's parts of all of us that remain split off and fragmented. Nobody is in perfect health. Everyone has a growing edge. And in a loving relationship, that edge is celebrated, not feared. Again, it seems to me to be quite parallel to the relationship of a mother and child. Love, good love, merger, has the ability to come together in wholeness, but also to separate and to see the other wholly. Not as a part object, not as a function, but as a whole other person who you recognize has feelings like you, who you recognize may at times fail you. But I love this old phrase. Your partner can fail you sometimes, but even a dog knows the difference between being tripped over and being kicked, okay? In the fusion end of the scale, people are kicking each other. If there's conflict on the merger side, it's because we trip over each other, because we're imperfect and we're human. And we can get up and apologize, apologizing for tripping the other person, apologizing for tripping over them. It's not a moral failure to be in conflict. It's not a moral failure to hurt the other person at a very small level. Overt hostility, intentional infliction of harm, these are things that don't exist in a healthy merger relationship. Now, can I be a little sarcastic? Can I be a little pointed? Can I be a little harsh sometimes on a bad day? Can I get primitive enough to be mean to my partner? Yes, I can. But if I'm healthy and whole, I recognize my mistake. I apologize to the person for doing it. I take personal responsibility for that mistake, for that hurt. I analyze why I would have done that. What part of primitive me got activated? Maybe what part of my partner evoked that in me. I explain that. She understands it in a way that gives her confidence it's not going to happen again, or at least in that way. She forgives me because I've made amends. I've attempted what Melanie Klein called an honest repair of the hurt, and that's the conflict we can grow from. If conflict results in that kind of resolution, then we are promoting internal structure, we are promoting integration, we are building love together and a much more satisfying relationship. Yay. I think in loving relationships there's tension. It's never perfect. There's tension between autonomy and the need to be in a relationship. Everybody needs to be alone now and then. There's nothing wrong with that. Everybody needs to be held and loved and contained by another. Nothing wrong with that either. And what happens sometimes is one person will need some solitude and another person will need some connection. And these are the inevitable conflicts of any healthy human relationship that you have to work out in an ongoing way, with an eye toward the past and an eye toward the future, hopefully. D.W. Winnicott, the great pediatrician psychoanalyst back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, also had this phrase of the good enough mother. You don't have to be a perfect mother to raise a healthy child. You have to be good enough. That is a fairly high standard, but you don't have to be perfect. I think Dr. Ecoff would agree that you can be a good enough partner, that a merger-style good love relationship does not require perfection. In fact, very often what we see is the idealization of a partner results in the devaluation of self. And that when the idealized, my partner is perfect, Prince Charming, when they make a mistake, they got nowhere to go but the depths. Oh, I thought he was Prince Charming, but he's a demon from hell. Okay, he wasn't Prince Charming to begin with, and he's not a demon from hell now, no matter what he did, right? Those extremes, those splitting dynamics that raise expectations to impossible heights and result in blame at impossible depths. That's not what the that's not what the merger relationship is about. We make mistakes, and you only have to be good enough. Again, a very high standard. That's not a get out of jail free card. That's not a license to abuse in any way. It requires good faith. It requires constant effort to be that kind of person in that kind of partnership. But nobody's expecting perfection here. That's primitive. Intimacy. In a merger relationship, there is true intimacy. And I think that means empathy, that you're known. And I don't know, folks, this one seems really important to me. Can you allow yourself to be deeply known by your partner, or are you hiding behind walls of defenses? Can you be in a relationship where you can be yourself? And God help your partner, she loves you anyway. If you can be in a relationship where you can truly be yourself and you are loved for being yourself, and you see your partner not hide behind walls of defenses, but you see them reveal themselves to you as honestly as they can in good faith, and you love them for that, and you love them for who they are, that's merger, that's good love, that's what it's supposed to look like. And that is what intimacy means. That's true intimacy. Not just telling each other your little secrets that are designed to communicate the impression of intimacy. Aha, there's that communication question again. What are you really communicating? Are you communicating honestly about yourself? Are you hearing honestly from your partner? Intimacy requires tremendous courage, and I think it requires courage more than maybe anything else, because you are risking rejection, you are risking abandonment, and you got to be a very strong person to be able to do that. We show our true selves rarely and with some trepidation. It's dangerous to do that. So it takes trust in a loving relationship to be able to be truly intimate. Is there give and take in a relationship? Yes, but not self-sacrifice. One never masochistically gives up oneself for the other. That's not love, that's fusion. There's mutuality, there's give and take, but there's a world of difference between give and take that's healthy and masochistic self-sacrifice. Self-valuation is the watchword there. The idea that I believe I am worthy of your love. I believe that you are worthy of my love. That's why I'm with you, one might say, in a healthy partnership. Again, I think this takes courage, and I think courage is the other side of playfulness. And I think this is one of the key indicators of a good love merger style relationship. Are the partners playful with each other? Are they playful generally? This may sound counterintuitive to some of you, but playfulness to me takes tremendous courage, because you are so confident in yourself. You can be goofy. You can try something new. You can get out there on a bit of a ragged edge and risk someone criticizing you, risk looking silly, risk looking foolish. Try on new ways of being and run it up the flagpole, see if it works. Playfulness requires tremendous courage and is serious business. When a child plays, what are they doing? They're trying on new identities. They're trying on the identity that they feel about themselves. It's not frivolous. Childhood play is the way they put together their identity in some ways. And I think adult playfulness is a key indicator of a self that's willing to try to become stronger. If you ask your partner, if you're getting to know somebody and you say, how do you play? What do you do for fun? And if they respond, I don't play. Play is for children. Well, your next word might fairly be, goodbye. We need to be able to play, to be loose and relaxed and let things sort of evolve creatively. There's a creativity in play, a creativity that I think only very healthy people can exhibit. Boundaries in fusion in a healthy love relationship, boundaries are respected. If my partner has a lock on a box, I don't break into it. I don't try to find the key. If I'm curious, I might ask. And she says, there's some stuff in here I'm not quite ready to talk to you about. I get to say, okay, hope you can talk to me about it sometime. I'm willing to listen. And if I'm honest about that, as opposed to, what the hell's in the box? If I feel threatened by that, maybe she's justified in keeping it from me. Maybe I'm not trustworthy in this new information. So I think boundaries are essential for a healthy relationship. One of the key indicators of fusion is that permeability of boundaries, the inability to tell where I stop and my partner starts. Sexuality in a healthy, loving relationship. Sexuality is fabulous. It is about an embodied presence. You're present to yourself. You're present to your partner. All the senses are in play. Okay, I think I can say this. If you are making love with your eyes closed and the lights off in the missionary position only and asking, are you done yet? Then you're in trouble. Then you're not in a healthy sexual intimate relationship. There ought to be eye contact. There ought to be lots of touching. There ought to be sound. There ought to be physical movement. There ought to be breathing involved. There ought to be the full embodied experience of each other's bodies and souls and minds and an integrated presence of self. And it ought to be a great deal of fun. And it ought to be creative and soothing. And I only half joke that if every once in a while in your sexual intimacy, if you're a healthy, loving couple, if you don't occasionally, in your playfulness, get a cramp and fall out of bed laughing because you tried something a little goofy and it didn't work, all right? If you hit the ground falling out of bed because your leg cramps up because you're trying something, and if you're laughing as you hit the ground and your partner is laughing as you hit the ground because it's so darn funny, you're okay. If you're having sex like that now and then, not all the time, but once in a while, you can kind of playfully get out on the ragged edge. And if it doesn't work, you can laugh about it, you're fine. And if you don't get out on the ragged edge now and then, something's too rigid about the way you're approaching each other's minds and hearts and bodies. I hope that wasn't too over the top. One of the key indicators of love and merger and healthiness is that imagination, creativity, broad-mindedness, openness to possibilities. You know people like this who are thoughtful. And I think creativity isn't an option in the human experience. Robert Caper wrote a book called Immaterial Facts, basically showing the theoretical changes from Freud to Melanie Klein. And he wrote something incredibly profound in the later chapters of that book that I always thought was important, that creativity is not just for the artists and the elites and the sculptors, that creativity is an absolutely essential dynamic of every human life. Whatever it is, whether you're a teacher or a student or a worker or a barista at Starbucks, I don't care. If you bring a certain proudful creativity to that, in your intimacy with your partners, are you creative? Do you have the strength and courage to be creative? I don't think creativity is an option. We have to live our lives in some level of developmental creativity. And I think people on the merger side of the scale who are healthy and whole enough to have that kind of creative imagination about what they're doing and who they're with lead much, much happier lives. More creativity, please, is the take-home lesson there. I've already talked about reparation and what repair. How to heal a split, how to repair an insult, a bit of hurt feelings, a mistake you made. Come on, who has not forgotten an anniversary or a birthday or some important date? Okay, every once in a while. Not very often, but sometimes. And if you're healthy, you're allowed to repair that damage in the way I've described before. I think what makes that possible is the accumulation of intimacy. Now, I've said before that child development is about the accumulation of experience. I think love, in some ways, is about the accumulation of intimacy. The ability to really be in the moment, conscious of that past and that hope for the future. It requires some strength. We have to be able to endure little mistakes by our partner. We have to be able to survive the little slights that we know, that we must know if we're healthy, are the difference between being tripped over and being kicked. Does a loving relationship require the idealization of our partner? Of course not. I think idealization is a problem. It's an absolute. It's black and white. It's my partner is perfect. All right? The princess or Prince Charming. Nobody can tolerate that for very long. Nobody can live that way for very long. So we have to manage what Dr. Ekoff calls non-catastrophic disappointment. What I just call the little bumps and grinds of everyday living. I'm going to hurt her feelings, she's going to hurt mine sometimes, and we got to deal with that. And yet, we have an illusion of our partner's qualities. If I tell some recent acquaintances about my wife, I'm going to put a certain spin on it. I'm pretty proud of her and I love her and I'm going to tell these people all about her. If they meet her later, they might have a feeling that I perhaps exaggerated her good qualities just a bit. But there's a difference between delusion, the idealization and devaluation of the fused personality, and the illusion of a merger relationship where we put our best and our partner's best foot forward. We hold them up in fairly high esteem, and it's pretty close to the truth. That to me seems like a perfectly reasonable stance to take. We look at our partner with great love, sometimes wonder, sometimes awe may be too much, but a certain level of pride that this wonderful person is with me. If you don't have that feeling about your partner, something's a little shaky. You need to move farther to the right on the scale. I think one of the key indicators of a healthy merger relationship is as Dr. Ekoff says, congruence between body, feelings, behavior, verbal expressions. You all know someone who has their stuff together, right? Who's got their act together. And I think that's a metaphor for something almost quite psychologically literal. That what they say and what they do and how they feel and their almost actual physical presence feels consistent. There's a certain overall presence to them that almost anybody around them can feel. You know someone like that. Someone walks into the room and everyone knows they're the big dog. They're the one with it together. They're the powerful one, male or female. And I think it means this, that when you sense that about someone, you sense their integration, their wholeness, the congruence of their various attributes formed into a whole. When you can achieve that almost artistic self-creation, then you're in a position to bring that to a partnership that's loving and soothing and healthy and may fairly earn the name of love. Okay, let me go through fairly quickly the Appendix A of Judy's article and sort of juxtapose, again, positions on these continuums. And you chart where you are in your current or perhaps past relationships, and perhaps chart where you want to be in your current relationship or in a future relationship. This, in some ways, is the most direct checklist on what you're doing and how you're doing it that I've ever heard of. So we have part object relating versus whole object relating. And I think that's a technical term of art in object relations theory, and it simply means that you treat people like a whole person. They're not a part object. And I've heard men say, well, I'm a breast man or I'm a leg man. And as soon as I hear that, I go, you're sick. You're pathological. You're a part object relating human being. You got to bring the whole woman into the picture, or you are at a very primitive, and I would suggest fused level of functioning. Now, there's nothing wrong with breasts or legs or any other part of the human body, but it's got to be in the context of a whole person, seen and experienced as a whole person. And if you don't feel that way about your partner, the odds are you don't feel that way about yourself. There are no innocent victims in a relationship. If you are part object relating, Dr. Ekoff suggests you are joining at a primitive level, almost in a parallel way, the way a baby joins with the mother, undifferentiated, symbiotic in the relationship. Mature joining is that ability to move in and out of the relationship without loss of self and without pain or feelings of catastrophic abandonment. This is a great example. Obsession versus passion. Obsession is perhaps a way to explain the sexual intensity of some fused relationships. I had a student several years ago in a class of, it was a psychology class for auto mechanics. It was a specialty class for their Renton Technical College's automotive department, and so I only had potential auto mechanic students in my class. And I had a young man raise his hand as I walked through this material or something similar to it, and he asked me point blank, Mr. Bigelow, how come only the crazy women are good in bed? And I was a little taken aback, and I thought, well, it's not true, and B, it meant that he couldn't distinguish between that obsessional physicality of the fused part-object relating person, the intensity of that emotional connection. And it is intense and it is emotional, but it isn't passionate in the healthy and whole way. A good sexual life ought to be intensely passionate, but not obsessive. And I think that young student didn't understand the difference back then, and I think that's a good way to put it. Okay. Mind-body split, mind-body union. And that's that congruence idea. The idea that in merger, I think and I feel and my body is congruent. In fused relationships, what people see frequently is that they seem to be disconnected. They don't have a coordinated sense of their physical presence. They seem to be all up in their heads all the time. They seem to be hyper-emotional. It isn't all connected, and I think that's a strong indication, if they are all connected, that you're heading in the right direction, and if they're not, the kind of work you need. Oh, I love this dichotomy. Submission to the other, surrender to the relationship. If you have a nuanced sense of the English language, that's powerful stuff. Submission. That's what people on the fuse side do. It implies the loss of identity. It's what a slave would do to a master. You submit to the master. But on the healthy side, you surrender to the relationship. Surrender in military terms can be a bad thing. It's a lot like submission. But in emotional language and in relationships, I think it implies a healthy giving over, a healthy commitment. The relationship is incredibly important to you. It provides you meaning in your life. You're not as good a man or woman outside of it as you are within it. It's the facilitator of your own growth. And you surrender to that in a way. That doesn't feel like you lose anything. It only feels like you gain something from it. Sadomasochistic union, egalitarian union. I think that's obvious. There's submission, which is healthy, versus surrender. In the fusion side, there's control and there's submission, and it's a hostile position. In a fusion side, despite gender differences, maybe because of them, there's an egalitarian union. This doesn't mean perfect equality, but egalitarian. There is a profound respect for the other. There is an empathic attunement to the other's mind and body and soul and heart. If I'm fused and my partner isn't around or something's wrong, I worry. I'm anxious. There's a problem. It's potentially rather dramatic. But if I'm over here and there's a problem, I have a capacity for concern. I'm concerned. I want to find a solution, but there's a difference between a capacity for concern and worry. I hope the language makes sense to you in some ways. That worry feels annihilating. Worry feels fragmenting. Worry feels like I'm in danger. If I'm concerned about something, I have an issue, a problem that with a little creativity I might solve. Projective identification is a primitive defense mechanism and a way of communicating. I commend my lecture on projective identification to you. It is the most powerful idea in the last 50 years in psychology. But Dr. Ecoff juxtaposes projective identification as a primitive defense mechanism against empathy. And if you understand projective identification, then this makes perfect sense. This idea that instead of enacting a communication that's partial between part objects, I feel the other person's presence and words and communications and emotions as a whole object. I think it's just a different way of saying part object versus whole object. To the fused, facts are feelings. To the fused, feelings are facts. To the merged, people truly in love, feelings are perceptions. They give us an opportunity to understand something about our minds. They're an opportunity to think. They're an opportunity to recognize something happening in a relational dynamic or out in the world. We have a feeling and we can wonder about its meaning and choose to behave in a way that works in the real world. Vague and unclear communication versus specific communication. I think that makes sense now. Concrete thinking, feelings are facts. Creative thinking, open to possibilities. Distortions of perception. If I'm angry, you're bad. The reality, the ability to accept an external reality that you have some sense of, what I call a reasonable, ascertainable reality. We will never know perfect reality. We can't. The philosophers have been trying to do that for 2,500 years, and nobody's gotten close to it. But you know what? You knock on wood, you walk around, you breathe the air, there's a reality out there, and most of our behaviors ought to comport with the demands of reality. When they do, mostly we're successful, hopefully. But concrete thinking doesn't allow that. distortions of perceptions that are based on an interior experience of anxiety and stress do not allow us to see things in reality. We have transference dynamics. We have projective identification happening in a massive way that distorts our ability to see what's really going on. We're in massive denial, to put it a different way, and you all know someone like that. Playfulness, enchantment, versus sort of no room for play. I think I've said enough about that. If you're creative, if you can wonder, and if you can feel some enchantment about life and your partner and living, you're moving in the right direction. If you can feel solitude and not feel isolation in being alone, you're better off. Passivity is often a sign of fusion. Creativity, what I would call aliveness. And you all know someone like this. You also know someone who comes in the room and there's this energy about them, this aliveness. You just want to stand next to them and breathe their air. Those are great people to be around. Can you foster that sense of aliveness in you? That's a true self. That's a healthy, whole, integrated sense of identity. It overflows with a sense of aliveness. If you can do that, you're in good shape. If there's a sense of determined passivity about what you do and how you experience the world, monitor that. Think about that in terms of how you are right here, right now. Do you basically take a passive stance toward the world, letting things happen? Or do you have a sense that you have some agency, that you have some control, that you can reach out there and make things happen? The alive person has a sense of that. Now, I don't mean some narcissistic grandiosity, think you can control the world, or you're Napoleon or something. That's delusional, that's malignant narcissism, that's mental illness. But really, do you have some agency in your life? Do you have some hope that you have some control, that you're moving forward, and the things that you do matter? That's the result of a merged sense of identity. Flooding and acting out versus containment and expression. Do you speak your feelings or do you rage them? Do you tell your partner, darling, I got to tell you, I'm a little angry right now, versus do you scream obscenities? I told a patient, a couple last week in couples counseling. Simple rule, Donovan Bigelow's simple rule of couples counseling. After their first session, they said, well, what do we do now? And I said, well, I have a simple rule. Number one, if you are yelling at each other, you're wrong. Stop yelling at each other, because they had been talking about yelling at each other quite a bit. And they looked at me kind of surprised, like, what? It's almost as if they didn't know how to communicate other than by yelling. And so that's the flooding and acting out that is generated by vulnerability. If you're a strong person, you don't need to scream and yell. You just need to speak your feelings honestly and with some empathy. Are you repeating childhood patterns of failed parenting? Or are you becoming more and more conscious of who you are and who you hope to become? Are you judging? Or can you exercise a benevolent curiosity about your own mind, that of your partner, and life in general? I think, to summarize Dr. Ekoff's approach, those may be the key words. Is your approach primarily judgmental? You're ready to judge yourself, you're ready to judge your partner, you're ready to judge everything all the time. You're quick to come to a conclusion. Judgment. Or do you have a playful sense, or the phrase is benevolent curiosity? Can you feel something and go, huh, I wonder what that means. I wonder where that's from. It seems like you've made me angry, but you know what? This doesn't feel quite as bad. This feels worse than what you did would warrant. Maybe I should think about that. Without judgment, just trying to understand how your mind works. I think if there's one character trait that would put you in the merger side over the fusion, it's the ability, not perfectly, not every time, but more often than not, to ask yourself those questions with some benevolent curiosity and to catch yourself when you're judging yourself or others harshly. Okay, the goal of this exercise, if there is an existential goal here, is to move into a relationship with yourself and your partner so that at the end of your life you can answer that question, yes, have I experienced enough as much true love in my long life as I could possibly have experienced? If the answer to that question is yes, then perhaps you understand what Dr. Ekoff was trying to do. Thank you very much.